It was December of 1944. In the Ardennes forest, the trees stood as stark skeletal silhouettes against a sky heavy with the promise of more snow. A sharp, unforgiving wind sliced through the landscape, driving the falling flakes in a relentless sideways assault across the frozen forest floor. Tucked beneath a camouflaged net, inside the frigid steel confines of an M10 Wolverine tank destroyer, Private First Class Ray Thompson peered through a fogged periscope. His breath formed in shallow, ghostly clouds. His gloved hands trembled, not from fear, but from the profound, bitter cold that had seeped through every inch of metal and was now deep in his bones. Just 800 yards away, a formidable line of German tanks snaked its way through the woods. He counted 12 of them, mostly Panzer IV models led by the unmistakable brutish form of a Tiger I at the front. Behind this armored vanguard, half-tracks filled with infantry rumbled forward while fuel trucks brought up the rear. Their objective was a vital crossroad, a lifeline that, if severed, would cut off all supplies and reinforcements to the 101st Airborne Division, which was at that very moment completely encircled in the besieged town of Bastogne. Thompson had no orders. He had no permission to fire. His instructions were explicit: wait, observe, report. But through his periscope, he could see the inevitable outcome. He could see the blade poised to fall, and so he made a decision. Without a single command, without clearance from anyone, Ray Thompson pulled the trigger, and in that instant everything changed. 3 days earlier, the rules of engagement had been made painfully clear. Inside a drafty farmhouse near the Belgian front, Ray Thompson sat hunched over a cold metal desk as his commanding officer briefed the crew of the 702nd Tank Destroyer Battalion. "No one fires without confirmation from command," the officer stated, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. "I don't care what you see. I don't care how close they are. We do not give away our position unless ordered." The room was silent, the men nodding in grim understanding, but beneath the surface a palpable tension simmered. Everyone knew the enemy was on the move, and they were moving with terrifying speed. Outside, the great German counteroffensive known as the Battle of the Bulge was just beginning. On December 16th, under the concealing cloak of fog and snow, the German army had launched its last desperate major offensive on the Western Front. Codenamed Operation Watch on the Rhine, its goal was audacious: to split the Allied line in two, capture the vital port of Antwerp, and force a negotiated peace. They struck with the force of a tidal wave, over 200,000 men and more than 1,000 tanks achieving absolute surprise. American lines buckled and in some places broke entirely. Entire units seemed to vanish overnight. Friendly positions were a fluid, uncertain concept, changing by the hour. In the ensuing confusion, many commanders feared that the most dangerous enemy might not be the one in front, but the friendly fire that could come from behind. The rule, therefore, was absolute: wait for orders. For Thompson, this meant the lonely, frigid task of observation duty. He and his 3-man crew were dug into a well-concealed position on a ridge near a forest road north of Noville, a critical crossroads town just outside Bastogne. They had excellent cover, ample range, and a commanding, icy view of the valley below. What they did not have was permission to engage. Day and night, Thompson scanned the terrain. Through his frosted scope, he meticulously marked fresh tank tracks in the snow, counted pine trees stripped bare by steel treads, and sketched enemy movements in a small notebook his mother had mailed him months before. He logged every variable: range, bearing, wind speed. But he did not fire. On one occasion, he had tracked a lone Panzer tank for nearly an hour as it crept near a ravine, a perfect target. No orders came. The tank passed, and the opportunity was lost. A quiet anger burned inside him, but his discipline held firm. He understood his job, and he understood the immense cost of a single mistake. One wrong shell could mean a dozen dead Americans, or a revealed position that would bring the wrath of an entire German artillery battery down upon them. But as the hours dragged on, and more enemy traffic moved through the trees, the question in his mind began to shift. Was holding fire truly the safer option? Thompson was not a reckless man. He was a precise one. He studied the German columns with the detached focus of a mathematician examining complex patterns. He knew how they moved, how they stacked their vehicles for mutual support, and how they relied on tight, disciplined formations for offensive power. More importantly, he knew their vulnerabilities. He knew exactly where to hit them, if and when the time ever came. He simply did not know yet that he would be the one to decide when that time was. Raymond Charles Thompson was not born a soldier. He grew up in the vast flat expanse of western Kansas, a land where the winter wind could peel paint from a barn and the summer heat could bake the wheat fields until the earth itself cracked open. His father, Charles, ran a small engine repair shop while his mother, Anna, taught 7th grade math. Ray grew up surrounded by gears, grease, and graph paper. Even as a boy, he possessed an intuitive understanding of the world through the lens of angles and geometry. He could tell you the precise distance to a grain silo simply by measuring the length of its shadow. While other kids played with simple slingshots, Ray was building a complex one with a pulley system and counterweights, obsessed with determining how far he could launch a pebble with absolute precision. He hadn't joined the Army out of a desire for combat. He enlisted in 1942 because he wanted to study engineering, and the Army offered him training, pay, and the promise of a future. He received the training. The pay was meager. As for the future, that was entirely dependent on surviving Europe. By the time Thompson arrived in Normandy, he was 22 years old but already looked 5 years older, his face etched with a quiet intensity. His first taste of combat came in the nightmarish hedgerows, where the enemy could be 10 feet away and remain completely invisible until the moment they opened fire. He watched a friend, Jimmy Delgado, burn to death when a Panzer shell turned their half-track into an inferno in a roadside ditch. He saw another, Frank Murray, vaporized by a mine outside St. Lo. After that, Thompson stopped believing in luck. He stopped believing in the absolute safety of orders or the concept of a safe distance. He started believing only in patterns and routines. He studied the way enemy tanks moved, where they paused, how long it took for a turret to rotate from one position to another. He began carrying a small spiral notebook in his jacket, and for every German vehicle he encountered, he would sketch it, meticulously noting its vulnerabilities and blind spots. He spoke little. Other soldiers nicknamed him the Quiet Clock, because when he did speak, his words were short, direct, and usually timed with unnerving precision. But when it came to gunnery, he was a master. Not flashy, not fast, but deadly accurate, predictable in the most lethal way possible. In the Army's official view, he was an exemplary gunner, disciplined, intelligent, and calm under fire. What they failed to realize, what even his own crewmates did not fully grasp, was that Ray Thompson was also a thinker, a tactician. He was not just a trigger puller. He was a man who could see the entire battlefield as a complex chessboard, and in 3 days' time, this quiet Kansan with the angle-obsessed brain would rewrite the rules of engagement with a single, devastating burst of firepower. Because sometimes war does not reward those who follow instructions. It rewards the ones who understand precisely when to break them. On the morning of December 19, 1944, the fog lay thick and low across the Ardennes, clinging to the branches of the pines like smoke. Vision was severely limited. Sound was distorted and muffled. But through his periscope, Ray Thompson saw them. First, the unmistakable silhouette of a Tiger I tank emerged from the mist, a beast of a machine with its long 88mm barrel and snarling, squared-off shoulders. Then came another and another. The German column was advancing along the forest road like a great steel serpent, a procession of at least 12 vehicles. It was a textbook armored assault column, clean, tight, and disciplined. At the very front, the Tiger acted as a battering ram, a vehicle capable of punching through nearly any defense the Americans could muster. Following it were 3 Panzer IV tanks, each fast, efficient, and deadly. Then came 2 half-tracks filled with infantry. Behind them were the support vehicles, ammunition trucks, fuel tankers, even field kitchens. The tail end of the column was protected by a self-propelled anti-aircraft gun, a clear sign that they were expecting contact and were prepared for anything. Anything, that is, except for one unauthorized American gunner in a lone M10 Wolverine. The road they traveled was perilously narrow, barely wider than the column itself. Steep forested banks rose on either side and thick trees hemmed them in. There was no room to maneuver, no space to scatter. To Thompson, it wasn't just a road. It was a perfectly laid trap. But here was the critical problem. Ray had no orders. No one else in his chain of command could see what he saw. Radio contact with his battalion's forward headquarters was weak, garbled, and mostly non-existent. The only way to reach them would be to reposition his tank, a move that would risk exposing his carefully concealed location. By protocol, he was supposed to observe the enemy, report their heading, and allow air support or artillery to take the lead. But Thompson wasn't just watching a column in transit. He was watching a dagger being aimed directly at the throat of the American line. That road led directly to the Nouville crossroads. If the Germans took Nouville, they would be able to flank the defenders at Bastogne from the north. The 101st Airborne Division, already completely surrounded, would lose its last major supply lifeline. The result would be an unmitigated catastrophe, with tens of thousands of American soldiers cut off and trapped in the brutal winter cold. And yet, the tanks kept moving forward, calm and confident, protected by the arrogant belief that the American forces were disorganized, terrified, and stretched too thin to mount any effective response. They were half right. Ray Thompson was scared. He was cold. He was utterly isolated. But he was not disorganized. He was calculating. He knew that if he fired too early, the column would scatter. If he hit the wrong target, the others might escape or return fire with overwhelming force. But if he fired with absolute precision, striking just the right vehicles in just the right order, he could accomplish something most officers would have deemed impossible. He could dismantle an entire armored column piece by piece, and he would have to do it without a single word from command, without any backup, and entirely without permission. He licked his lips, his fingers finding the elevation dial on his gun sight. He took one last, long look at the formation and waited for the moment that no training manual had ever prepared him for. Ray Thompson had never fired without orders. Not once. Not in training, not during the bloody campaign across France, not even when his instincts had screamed at him to pull the trigger days earlier as a lone Panzer crossed his scope. But now, staring at a perfectly exposed German armored column, crawling forward with the predictable rhythm of clockwork, he realized a fundamental truth. Waiting was no longer caution. Waiting was suicide. And so, with no radio contact, no green light from command, and no one to back him up, Ray adjusted the angle of his gun, held his breath, and fired. But he didn't aim for the lead tank. He aimed for the third. The armor-piercing round left the barrel of the M10 Wolverine with a thunderous roar that shattered the winter quiet and kicked a wave of snow into the air. The shell struck the 3rd Panzer IV directly in its flank armor. The explosion sent a violent shockwave through the trees as a plume of fire and black smoke erupted into the fog. The sound of screaming metal echoed through the valley. The entire column ground to a halt. But Thompson wasn't finished. As his loader rammed home the next shell, Thompson ordered his driver to shift position slightly, 5 yards to the left, just enough to throw off any German gunners who would now be desperately scanning for his muzzle flash. Then he fired again. This time his target was the 6th vehicle in the line. The blast ripped through a half-track carrying infantry. Its fuel tank ignited instantly, and the resulting explosion threw bodies into the trees. The fire spread rapidly to the dry underbrush, lighting the forest floor in ghastly patches of orange and black. The Germans were no longer just halted. They were panicking. The formidable Tiger tank at the front attempted to reverse, but the column was packed too tightly on the narrow road. The crew inside the Tiger shouted and gestured furiously, trying to clear a path, but it was useless. Behind them, the rest of the formation was now completely bottlenecked, blinded by smoke, illuminated by fire, and boxed in by their own vehicles. Thompson reloaded again. His crew, now fully alert and understanding the gravity of the situation, didn't question his orders. They followed his lead with practiced efficiency. He fired at the 8th vehicle, a fuel truck. The result was instantaneous and biblical. The explosion rocked the entire hillside, sending flames jetting skyward like a volcanic eruption. The force of the blast knocked 2 nearby infantrymen to the ground, and the massive fireball backlit the other tank silhouettes, turning them into ghostly shadows against the flames. From a distance, it would have sounded like a full-scale artillery ambush. In reality, it was one man, one gun, and an unshakable gut feeling. But the sequence of his shots was anything but random. Thompson had spent months studying German military doctrine. He understood their reliance on tight formations, and he knew the cold logic behind their vehicle placement. Fuel and support in the rear, heavy armor in the front, and infantry in the middle. By taking out the 3rd vehicle, he had created an immovable physical block. By hitting the 6th, he had jammed the middle of the column. And by targeting the 8th, the fuel truck, he had crippled their ability to retreat and ignited widespread chaos. It was a chain reaction firing pattern, a surgical disruption of the enemy's tactical structure. Each shot was a scalpel, not a hammer. The Germans, now thoroughly confused and cut off from one another, began firing wildly into the trees. Their machine gunners riddled snowbanks and empty tree trunks. Infantrymen scrambled for cover behind the flaming wrecks, completely unsure of where the devastating fire was originating from. To them, it felt like a perfectly orchestrated trap, a deadly ambush laid by an entire battery of American tank destroyers. But there was no ambush. There was no battery. There was only Ray Thompson and a crew who had stopped asking questions and started following the lead of their quiet, calculating gunner. As the enemy scrambled in disarray, Thompson moved again, using the forest terrain like a seasoned sniper. He understood angles. He knew how far his gun could reach without revealing too much of his own position. Every new firing location was chosen for its cover, for its elevation, and for its ability to inflict maximum confusion upon the enemy. He wasn't just shooting. He was dismantling an enemy force, and each carefully placed blast was another page torn directly from the German field manual. The Ardennes, which had been wrapped in a profound silence just moments before, now screamed with the sounds of destruction. Trees cracked and fell under the force of the shock waves. Snow, fire, and shrapnel filled the air like confetti from some hellish celebration. Thompson's third shot had detonated a fuel truck. His fourth struck a half-track that had been attempting to reverse. Its wheels were already spinning uselessly in the icy mud when the shell hit, sending its chassis skyward in a twisted arc of burning steel. The German Tiger at the front of the column was hopelessly stuck. Its crew tried desperately to reverse, but they were trapped between the flaming wreckage before them and the paralyzed vehicles behind them. Their tight, disciplined formation, so brutally effective on open terrain, had now become their steel coffin on the narrow forest road. From Thompson's vantage point, the chaos unfolded in what felt like slow motion. He saw soldiers yelling, their arms waving frantically as confusion turned to sheer panic. German infantry began to abandon their vehicles, scattering into the dense woods. Some took cover behind trees, while others sprinted blindly into the snow, stumbling and slipping on frozen roots. One officer made the fatal mistake of climbing on top of a tank to get a better view, and was immediately cut down by a burst from Thompson's coaxial .50 caliber machine gun. Inside the M10, the crew was now sweating profusely, not from fear, but from the sheer physical exertion of maintaining such a high rate of fire. The loader's hands were blistered and raw. The assistant gunner's voice was hoarse from yelling coordinates. The small interior of the tank was filled with the acrid smell of grease, hot metal, and cordite. But Ray Thompson himself was like ice, completely focused. Every shot he took was born from cold calculation, not from adrenaline or rage, but from pure practiced mathematics. He was repositioning his tank destroyer after every 2 shells. These were not large movements, 10 yards here, 20 there, but they were enough to make the German gunners constantly doubt their aim. The smoke from the burning vehicles helped. The thick fog helped. The difficult terrain helped. But the real advantage was psychological. The Germans were convinced they were facing a much larger force. They believed they had stumbled into a multi-unit ambush. Some survivors would later guess they were attacked by 4 tanks. Others would insist it was at least 8. There were even panicked reports of American artillery batteries hidden in the hills, though no such batteries existed anywhere in that sector. The truth was almost unbelievable. It was a single M10 tank destroyer with a 3-man crew and a gunner who was supposed to be silently following orders. By the 30-minute mark, the road was completely clogged with burning steel. At least 5 enemy vehicles were utterly destroyed and another 3 were immobilized. Survivors from the rear support crews had already turned and fled back down the forest trail. The Tiger at the front finally managed to pivot its massive turret, rotating it toward the ridge where Thompson had last fired from. Thompson didn't flinch, he waited. He knew the Tiger's armor was thickest at the front but significantly weaker on its sides, and if you knew the exact moment when it turned, when its hull exposed just a sliver of its flank during a repositioning maneuver, that was your window of opportunity. The 5th shell left the barrel and struck home. A bright hot flash tore through the Tiger's side armor. For a terrifying second, the behemoth held together. Then its internal ammunition cooked off. The entire turret launched upward in a massive plume of fire, landing several yards away in the snow. The blast was so violent that it knocked the German anti-aircraft gun at the rear of the column off balance. Its stunned gunners dropped their weapons and ran for their lives into the trees. Smoke now poured into the forest like low-lying clouds. The wreckage glowed eerily beneath the gray morning light, and the road that had once been a pipeline of armored strength was now a burning bottleneck of total destruction. One of Thompson's crewmen, his face pale, looked at him and asked, "Are we still going to get court-martialed for this?" Thompson didn't answer. He just ordered another round to be loaded. The job wasn't finished yet. Hours later, under interrogation in a makeshift American holding tent, a captured German lieutenant struggled to find the words to describe what had happened. His face was smudged with ash, his coat was half burned, and his eyes were glassy with shock. He spoke in fits and starts, his voice stammering. "There were many guns," he said in broken English. "Maybe 6, maybe more. We were attacked by a full battery." The American intelligence officers exchanged puzzled glances. There hadn't been a battery in that sector. There hadn't even been a full platoon. There was just one M10 Wolverine and its gunner who, officially, had never been given permission to fire. Other German prisoners described the event differently, their accounts colored by the chaos and terror of the moment. Some said it was an ambush laid by paratroopers armed with anti-tank weapons. Others claimed the Americans had planted mines and booby traps, insisting it was evidence of sabotage, not gunnery. One young soldier, barely 20 years old, swore he saw muzzle flashes coming from 3 different angles simultaneously. But the flash pattern had all come from a single source, Thompson, who had methodically moved his tank after every few shots. In their confusion, the Germans had begun to invent enemies that simply didn't exist. Fear had filled in the blanks. Even seasoned tank commanders reported seeing the silhouettes of American armor deeper in the trees. In the disorienting chaos of burning wrecks, thick smoke, and a completely disintegrated command chain, they imagined what they couldn't possibly identify. It wasn't cowardice. It was psychology. They simply could not believe that one man, one gun could have done all that. To them, it was an impossibility that a single tank destroyer could have struck with such perfect timing, such lethal precision, and such a devastating overall effect. And in a way, they were right. This hadn't been an act of brute force. This had been an act of surgical disruption. Thompson's calculated decision to fire at specific targets, the 3rd, 6th, and 8th vehicles, followed a logic that no German unit had been prepared for. German doctrine taught that American forces were slow to respond and overly reliant on receiving orders from above. Their core assumption was that Americans were efficient only when they had superior numbers, not when they had to rely on improvisation. But Thompson had shattered that expectation. He had thought like a German commander, anticipated their formation's weakness, and then struck like a ghost. One prisoner described it as if the trees themselves had opened fire on them. When American forces finally moved in to clear the road hours later, what they found stunned even the most hardened veterans. The wreckage looked like the aftermath of a coordinated airstrike. Vehicles were stacked like fallen dominoes, their burned-out frames fused together by the intense heat. Frozen corpses were sprawled across the snow, some still clutching their rifles. Trees were splintered like toothpicks, and tank tracks were bent sideways, dug deep into the frozen dirt. But above all, what was missing, what made the scene so strange, was the complete absence of any American dead. There were none because there had only ever been one gunner. From that day forward, the survivors from that ill-fated German column would refer to the incident with a single, haunting phrase, Die Geister Battery, the Ghost Battery. For 48 agonizing hours, Ray Thompson expected to be arrested. After the shooting stopped, after the smoke finally cleared and the surviving Germans had either fled or surrendered, he sat motionless inside the M10. His loader offered him a sip of water from a canteen. He didn't respond. The adrenaline had completely drained away, replaced by a cold, heavy dread. They had disobeyed direct orders. They had fired without permission. And regardless of how many enemy tanks now lay burning on the road, the military had its rules. Back at the battalion headquarters, Thompson filed his official report. His commanding officer, a captain from Pittsburgh named Langston, read it without saying a word. He flipped through the pages, examining Thompson's precise sketches, his range estimates, and the diagram of his firing sequence. His face was a mask of conflicting emotions, anger, disbelief, and something akin to awe. "You know," Langston finally said, his voice low, "if this had gone wrong, if even one of those shells had been friendly fire." Thompson simply nodded. He offered no excuses. "I knew what I saw," he said quietly. Langston stared at him for a long moment, then exhaled slowly. "No one authorized this, Thompson. You understand that?" "I do," Thompson replied. Langston didn't reprimand him, not yet. Instead, he said, "Go get some rest. I've got to send this upstairs." Upstairs meant division command, which meant intense scrutiny, which often meant severe punishment, especially for enlisted men who dared to act outside of established protocol. Thompson returned to his crew. They were quiet, too. There was no back-patting, no celebration. They were all just waiting for the hammer to fall. But it didn't, not immediately. Because something else happened first. Scouts from the 101st Airborne arrived. They came through Noville 2 days later, their faces hollow and their eyes rimmed red from sleepless nights and constant exposure in their trenches. They had fully expected to find that crucial forest road crawling with German armor. Instead, they found a graveyard of twisted, burned-out German wreckage. They asked which unit had taken it out. Captain Langston replied that it wasn't a unit. It was one gunner. Word spread faster than official orders ever could. In mess tents, in supply lines, and across battalion radios, people began talking about the quiet guy from Kansas who had single-handedly taken out an entire Panzer column. Some exaggerated the story, claiming it was 10 tanks that he had done it with only 5 shells. But in the middle of this growing legend, the official investigation began. Division intelligence reviewed Thompson's detailed field notes. They interviewed his loader and his assistant gunner. They even tried to contact higher command to confirm Thompson's radio situation on that fateful day. They were unable to prove disobedience because there was no clear record of any orders having been received. The radio lines had been jammed. Thompson's crew had tried to report, but nothing had come back. What they could confirm, however, was the kill count. 7 vehicles completely destroyed, 4 more disabled, and 0 American casualties. 1 critical strategic objective, Noville's North Road, had been held. 1 airborne unit, cut off and under siege, had been reconnected to its vital supply lines. And 1 decision, made in silence and without clearance, had kept that corridor open. Langston was called in to relay the final disposition on the matter. He expected at best a severe reprimand for his man. What came instead was something far more unusual. The division commander said, "Don't put this in the official briefing. Not yet, but tell your gunner. We'll be watching his work." Thompson didn't receive a medal, not then, but he wasn't court-martialed. In fact, he was quietly reassigned to train other gunners on firing pattern theory, how to disable entire convoys through tactical sequencing rather than just brute force. No one used the word hero, no one saluted, but he was asked to diagram his decision-making process, and his diagrams were sent to Fort Sill, Oklahoma, to the U.S. Army Artillery School. That's when it finally hit him. They hadn't just forgiven what he had done, they were studying it. Langston approached him one evening, weeks later, while Thompson was cleaning the breech of a recoilless rifle. "You know," Langston said, "I was ready to report you for insubordination." Thompson looked up. Langston shrugged. "But then I read that line in your notebook. The one about controlled collapse. What did you mean by that?" Thompson wiped his hands on a rag. "When you pull one stone from a wall," he said, "the rest falls. If you know where to pull." A slow smile spread across Langston's face. "Well, next time you decide to knock down a wall, just give me a little warning." Thompson didn't smile back. He just nodded. Because to him it hadn't been a victory. It had been a solution, a calculation, a grim necessity, and deep down, he knew that it could have easily gone the other way. He had made his peace with that possibility. But war does not always punish disobedience. Sometimes it learns from it. Ray Thompson never asked to be remembered. He didn't keep journals and he didn't pose for photographs. After the war, he went home to Kansas, married a girl named Helen from the next town over, and started a small repair shop near Dodge City. He fixed tractors, built grain silos, and taught his son geometry by marking angles in the dirt with a stick. He never once called himself a hero, but others did. Because years after the Battle of the Bulge, the U.S. Army quietly began teaching a new concept they called asymmetrical engagement sequencing, a fancy term for a deceptively simple and revolutionary idea. Don't aim for the front, aim for the collapse. The primary case study they used was a single undocumented engagement outside Noville, Belgium. They showed grainy overhead maps of a forest road, displaying wreckage patterns, vehicle placements, and firing trajectories. No names were given. The file was unclassified but buried deep within artillery doctrine manuals that most officers never read. Still, the students at Fort Sill, and later at Fort Benning, studied it. They studied it because it worked. They studied it because it saved lives. They studied it because it fundamentally changed the understanding of what one gunner could accomplish, not through overwhelming firepower, but through geometry, through logic, and through the profound willingness to act when orders fall silent. Years later, a colonel who had studied Thompson's engagement as a young lieutenant would summarize it this way: he didn't break orders. He operated beyond them. It was the ultimate paradox. A man who had disobeyed the strict chain of command had become the very model for flexible, modern battlefield thinking. His unofficial firing pattern technique was later integrated into Cold War doctrine, especially in training tank destroyer crews on how to disable numerically superior Soviet armored columns in Eastern Europe. The concept was simple but revolutionary: create artificial choke points through selective targeting, and then exploit the enemy's own formation discipline against them. And it all came from a quiet Kansas farm kid who had never attended college. Decades later, a military historian stumbled across the original field report filed by Captain Langston, buried in a dusty cardboard box of World War II after-action reports. The historian eventually tracked down Thompson, now in his 80s, quiet and slightly deaf, living in a modest home with his wife and a cat named Murphy. He asked Ray about that day in the Ardennes. Ray took a long time to answer. Then he said, "I remember the trees. I remember how still it was before the first shot, like the world was holding its breath." He didn't speak of victory or glory or regret. He spoke only of precision, of necessity. When asked why he hadn't waited for orders, his reply was simple and profound: because by the time the radio worked, it would have been too late. He paused, then added, "I didn't break the rules. I just stepped past them for a minute, long enough to do what had to be done." That answer never made it into the official history books, but it stuck with the historian, and now perhaps it will stick with you. Ray Thompson didn't win the war, but he saved a road. He saved a column of paratroopers. He saved a moment, and in war sometimes that is everything. He reminded an entire army that courage isn't always loud. Sometimes it whispers, sometimes it calculates, and sometimes it pulls the trigger, not out of defiance but out of a deeper understanding of duty. One gunner, one decision, one pattern, and an entire German armored column was brought to its knees.